Willowbrook was the sort of English village that seemed to have been arranged rather than grown. The cottages leaned into one another with deliberate charm, roses trained carefully over low stone walls, and the church spire rose above it all like a patient finger, reminding everyone of order and restraint. Even the river, which wound lazily past the mill, appeared to have been persuaded to behave itself. On that June afternoon the village fete was in full bloom upon the green. White bunting fluttered between two ancient oaks, and the air carried the mingled scents of lemonade, damp grass, and freshly baked scones. There was a brass band playing slightly out of tune beneath a striped canvas awning, and the local vicar, the Reverend Lionel Harcourt, was circulating with a smile that suggested he had shaken more hands than was strictly necessary for one lifetime. It was precisely the sort of occasion where nothing should ever go wrong, and yet as the clock of St. Mary's Church struck 3:30, something did. It began, as such things often do, with a scream that did not quite belong to the occasion. At first many assumed it was part of the coconut shy, where the children shrieked with exaggerated triumph or disappointment. But this scream was different, short, sharp, and abruptly cut off, as though the air itself had refused to carry it further. A small crowd began to gather near the embroidery stall where Mrs. Lillian Frobisher had been demonstrating hand-stitched table linens. The stall itself was an elegant arrangement of lace, thread, and pastel fabrics, exhibition of patience and domestic pride. Now, however, Mrs. Frobisher lay half-slumped behind the table, one hand still curled around a spool of pale blue silk thread. Her face was ashen, her eyes open in a way that suggested surprise rather than fear. The fete for a moment forgot how to breathe. Then the noise returned in fragments, shocked voices, hurried footsteps, the sudden authority of someone shouting for a doctor. Within minutes, the illusion of village peace had fractured completely. It was nearly an hour later when the first serious attempt at order was restored. The police constable, a young man named Harris, who had not yet learned how to conceal his nerves, stood rather rigidly near the embroidery stall, as though afraid it might accuse him of something. The local doctor had come and gone with a tight expression. The Reverend Harcourt had begun repeating the phrase, "most unfortunate," at regular intervals, as if repetition might soften its meaning. By then the rumor had already taken root. "She was poisoned, I tell you," declared Miss Ice. Peabody from the cake stall, her voice trembling with both excitement and horror. "It was her heart," insisted Mr. Griggs, who always preferred natural explanations that required no further thought. "No, no," said another voice. "It was that stranger, the one from London." Ah, yes, the stranger. There was always a stranger in such cases. And yet, as the village began to arrange its suspicions like cards in a familiar game, one figure remained apart from the confusion. She sat quietly beneath the shade of a chestnut tree at the edge of the green, her hands folded neatly in her lap, observing without interruption. To most villagers she was simply an elderly lady of no particular consequence, slight in build, with a gentle face and an expression of attentive politeness. But those who knew her even slightly understood that Miss Jane Marple saw rather more than she ever appeared to. Miss Marple watched the scene unfold with the mild interest of someone observing a pattern she had seen before, though never in quite the same form. She had arrived at the fete late, having been detained by a small difficulty involving her knitting wool and a particularly stubborn knot. By the time she reached the green, the excitement had already begun to ripple outward like ink spilled into water. Now she looked at the embroidery stall, at the overturned chair, at the pale blue silk thread still clutched in the dead woman's hand. "Such a delicate color," she murmured softly to herself. A young constable approached her hesitantly. "Excuse me, ma'am. I'm afraid you mustn't remain here." "Oh, yes, of course," Miss Marple replied gently. "I quite understand. Only I was wondering, has anyone thought to check whether she pricked herself?" The constable blinked. "Pricked herself?" "With a needle," she said, as though it were the most natural thought in the world. "One does occasionally faint from something so very small, you know, especially in warm weather." He hesitated, uncertain whether to dismiss her or take her seriously. In the end he did neither, which was often the safest course when dealing with elderly ladies who spoke in such a manner. By evening the official verdict had begun to take shape. The death, the doctor confirmed, was not natural. Something subtle, precise, and deliberately administered had ended Mrs. Frobisher's life. The word poison was now spoken openly, though still with a kind of reverent reluctance, and with poison came suspicion. The embroidery stall became a focal point of investigation. Mrs. Frobisher's belongings were carefully examined. Her purse, her sewing box, her neatly folded notes for upcoming orders. Nothing appeared immediately out of place, and yet everything now seemed potentially significant. The police quickly identified a suspect. Mr. Edward Loring, a visiting textile supplier from London, had been seen speaking with the deceased shortly before her collapse. He was a man of polished manners and careful speech, and in a village such as Willowbrook, such qualities were often interpreted as concealment rather than refinement. By nightfall he had been detained for questioning. The village, relieved to have a direction for its anxiety, accepted this with enthusiasm. "He always looked a bit sly to me," said Mrs. Peabody. "I said from the start it was the stranger," Mr. Griggs repeated proudly. Only Miss Marple did not appear convinced. Later that evening she walked slowly back along the quiet lane toward her cottage. The fair ground was now half dismantled, lanterns swaying gently in the cooling air, their light flickering like uncertain thoughts. The village, for all its noise, had begun to settle into its familiar rhythms again. But beneath that surface calm something had shifted. Miss Marple paused briefly by the hedgerow. A blackbird called once, sharply, then fell silent. "Poor Mrs. Frobisher," she said softly. "So careful with her stitches. One does wonder." She did not finish the sentence. Instead, she turned and walked on, her expression thoughtful. For in her experience, people rarely died because of strangers. They died because of something far more intimate, something as delicate and as easily overlooked as a thread drawn too tightly through fabric. And somewhere in Willowbrook that thread had already begun to unravel. The morning after the fête arrived in Willowbrook with an almost indecent sense of normality. Birds sang as if nothing had changed. Curtains were drawn back as usual. Milk bottles stood on doorsteps, glistening with early dew. And yet behind every polite greeting and every carefully poured cup of tea, something had shifted like a cracked teacup that still holds liquid but no longer feels entirely safe to drink from. At the Frobisher residence, a modest stone house near the church lane, the shutters remained half-closed. A black ribbon had already been tied to the gate, fluttering gently in the morning breeze. Inside, the world had become quiet in a way that was not peaceful. Mrs. Lillian Frobisher was now referred to only in the past tense, and the village, as villages do, was already beginning to rearrange her memory into something more manageable. Miss Marple was up early. She had not slept particularly well, though she would never have admitted it in so many words. Instead, she attributed her early rising to a slight stiffness in the knees, which sounded both respectable and sufficient. She sat by her window in her small cottage, a teacup in hand, watching the light slowly spread across her garden. Everything there was in Orderosa's carefully tended, pathways neatly swept, nothing left to chance. It gave her a certain comfort. But her mind was not in the garden. It was in Willowbrook Green. Miss Marple had lived long enough to understand that sudden death in a peaceful place rarely came from sudden causes. It was almost always the result of something slow, something overlooked, something that had been growing quietly in plain sight. And sewing, she thought, was an interesting detail. Précision, patience, and the possibility of something being hidden in the most delicate of places. She set down her teacup. "I think," she said to herself quietly, "I shall go and call upon Mrs. Elridge." Mrs. Elridge ran the village post office and knew everything that passed through Willowbrook, whether she meant to or not. She was also the sort of woman who considered silence to be slightly suspicious in itself. When Miss Marple entered the small shop, the bell above the door gave a cheerful ring that felt almost inappropriate under the circumstances. "Oh, Miss Marple," Mrs. Elridge exclaimed. "Terrible business, isn't it?" "Terrible." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed mildly. "Very sad indeed. I was wondering if Mrs. Frobisher had been receiving many parcels recently." Mrs. Elridge leaned forward instantly. "Parcels? Well, now, that's interesting you should ask. She had one only last week, very neatly wrapped. No return address." Miss Marple's eyes brightened slightly. "No return address?" And she seemed, well, I wouldn't like to say nervous exactly, but certainly preoccupied. "And did she say what it contained?" Mrs. Elridge lowered her voice. "She said it was sewing materials, special silk thread." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Silk thread," she repeated. There was a pause. Outside, a cart rattled past, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked once before falling silent again. Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Elridge politely and left the shop, her mind already turning over the detail like a bead between fingers. Silk thread was not unusual. but secrecy was. Meanwhile, at the small police station, the investigation had settled into a confident rhythm. Constable Harris, still slightly overwhelmed, had been joined by Inspector Gerald Whitcomb from the county office, a man of brisk manner and firm opinions. Inspector Gerald Whitcomb had already decided that the case was in essence simple. A visiting salesman, he said, tapping his notebook. Opportunity. Presence at the scene. Likely financial dispute. Constable Harris nodded dutifully. "And motive?" he asked. Whitcomb gave a faint shrug. "These things rarely lack motive. We'll find it soon enough." Mr. Edward Loring sat in the adjoining room, composed but pale. His hands rested neatly on the table, and his expression remained carefully controlled. He had answered all questions with precision. Too much precision, some might have thought. And in a village like Willowbrook, precision often looked like guilt. By midday, gossip had become certainty. Mr. Loring was guilty. The village had agreed upon it with the efficiency of long practice. Only Miss Marple, walking slowly along the lane toward the churchyard, remained unconvinced. She paused near the gate of the Frobisher house. A young woman stood there, Miss Clara Wren, Mrs. Frobisher's assistant at the embroidery stall. Her eyes were red from crying, but her posture was stiff, controlled. "I'm so sorry," Miss Marple said gently. Miss Wren nodded quickly. "It's all so dreadful. Everyone is saying such things." "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "They often do." There was a brief silence. Then Miss Marple asked almost casually, "Did Mrs. Frobisher ever complain of headaches?" Miss Wren blinked. "Headaches? No. Or perhaps dizziness." Another pause. "Well," Miss Wren said slowly, "she did once mention feeling faint after handling some new thread, but she said it was nothing." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened slightly. "New thread," she repeated. Miss Wren nodded. "A special silk. Very fine. It came in a plain parcel." Silk again. Miss Marple thanked her and continued walking, though her steps were now slower, more thoughtful. Something about the phrase lingered in her mind. Fine silk. Too fine, perhaps, for ordinary use, or too carefully prepared. That afternoon a second piece of information reached the police station. The silk thread in Mrs. Frobisher's possession had been tested. It contained a trace of a substance that should not, by any reasonable explanation, have been there. Inspector Whitcomb's confidence did not waver. "Accidental contamination is unlikely," he said firmly. "This strengthens the case." Constable Harris swallowed. "So it was definitely murder, sir?" "Yes," Whitcomb replied. "And we already know who." But at that exact moment in her quiet cottage Miss Marple was looking at her knitting basket, and noticing something very small indeed. Not missing, not broken, but subtly altered in a way most people would never think to question. She leaned back slightly in her chair. "Oh, dear," she said softly. "That is very interesting indeed." The village of Willowbrook remained calm on the surface, but beneath it something had begun to shift almost imperceptibly, like a stitch pulled just a little too tight. And Miss Marple knew from long experience that once a stitch begins to pull, the whole fabric is never quite the same again. Willowbrook had always believed in its own innocence. It was a belief reinforced by routine morning church bells, afternoon teas, polite greetings exchanged over low garden fences. Even gossip here had manners. It did not shout, it whispered. It did not accuse directly, it suggested. But by the third day after the death of Mrs. Lillian Frobisher, suggestion had hardened into something sharper. And certainty in a village like Willowbrook was a dangerous thing when it had not yet been earned. At the Frobisher house the curtains remained drawn. Inside, Miss Clara Wren moved through her duties like someone trying to behave normally in a world that had lost its balance. She folded cloths that did not need folding, rearranged drawers that were already neat, and avoided looking too long at the embroidery table where Mrs. Frobisher had once worked with such precise pride. The silence of the house felt heavier than grief. It felt watched. That morning a small discovery had unsettled the police investigation in a way Inspector Whitcomb did not appreciate. The silk thread, what should have been an ordinary material used for embroidery, had revealed something unexpected under chemical testing. Not poison in the dramatic sense the village preferred to imagine, but something more subtle, something engineered to be unnoticed until it was too late. A slow effect, a delayed reaction, a calculated design. Inspector Whitcomb was not pleased with ambiguity. "This does not change the suspect," he insisted sharply. "It only explains method." Constable Harris, who had begun to develop a cautious respect for uncertainty, said nothing. But inside the station the neat structure of the case had begun to loosen. Meanwhile Miss Marple had returned to a place where she often found clarity, her knitting basket. Miss Marple sat in her armchair by the window, the soft morning light falling across her lap as she examined a length of wool between her fingers. To most people it was an ordinary domestic scene. To her it was evidence of how things were constructed, and how they came apart. "Threads are never just threads," she murmured. She adjusted her glasses and looked again at something she had noticed the night before, a slight irregularity in her wool, a faint inconsistency in texture. Not enough to alarm anyone, not enough to be noticed in passing, but enough if one knew what to look for. She set it aside carefully. Then she said, almost to herself, "Someone understands materials very well indeed." Later that morning she paid a visit to the churchyard, not because she expected answers there, but because she expected perspective. The Reverend Harcourt was tending to the flower-beds near the path, his sleeves rolled up in quiet determination. He looked older than he had at the fete. "A tragic business," he said as she approached. "Poor Mrs. Frobisher. Such a devoted woman." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed gently. "Devotion often hides many things." The Reverend paused. "You think there is something hidden?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, I think there is always something hidden, Reverend. The question is only whether one looks closely enough." He studied her for a moment, slightly unsettled. Then, almost hesitantly, he said, "There was a parcel she received a few weeks ago. I remember because I was delivering something to the house at the time." Miss Marple's attention sharpened. "A parcel?" "Yes, very plain. No markings. She seemed reluctant to open it in front of me." "And did she say anything about it?" The Reverend frowned, trying to recall. "Only that it was for her work, something to improve the quality of her embroidery." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Improvement," she repeated softly. That afternoon Inspector Whitcomb received a report that shifted the case once again. Mr. Edward Loring had no financial disputes with Mrs. Frobisher. No debts, no quarrels, no known motive. It was an inconvenient fact, and Inspector Whitcomb treated inconvenient facts the way some people treated bad weather, by refusing to let them alter plans. "Then the motive is personal," he declared. "It always is." But he did not yet know where to look for it. Miss Marple, however, was no longer looking at people in isolation. She was looking at connections, at patterns, at the invisible stitching that held the village together. And as she walked slowly back along the lane, she found herself thinking again of silk thread. Almost invisible, the kind of material that could pass unnoticed through careful hands, until it was too late. That evening a second conversation reached her attention. Miss Clara. Wren had been speaking to a neighbor in distress. "I never understood why she insisted on using that special thread," Clara had said. "She said it made her work stronger, but it always seemed strange." Miss Marple repeated the word quietly in her mind, and for the first time a connection began to form, not complete, not yet, but present. A structure beneath the surface, a design. As dusk settled over Willowbrook, Miss Marple stood at her cottage window once more. The village lights flickered on one by one, warm and familiar, but she no longer saw warmth, she saw arrangement. People positioned carefully in their lives, like stitches in a pattern that someone had chosen with intent. And somewhere in that pattern a thread had been placed that did not belong. She folded her hands. "I think," she said softly, "someone is making something very carefully indeed." A pause. Then she added, "And I think it is not embroidery they are interested in." By the fourth day Willowbrook had settled into a new routine, the routine of investigation. It was not a pleasant routine, but villages adapted quickly. Where once there had been talk of weather and harvests, there was now talk of evidence and motive. Where once Mrs. Frobisher's embroidery had been admired for its delicacy, it was now examined for hidden meaning. Even the church notice board seemed to carry a different weight, as though truth itself might be pinned there if someone looked closely enough. Mr. Edward Loring remained in police custody. He did not complain. This, in Inspector Whitcomb's view, was suspicious in itself. "A guilty man often becomes quiet once confronted with certainty," he said firmly. Constable Harris, who had begun to suspect that certainty was less reliable than it sounded, made a careful note but said nothing. The interrogation room was small, plain, and deliberately unwelcoming. Mr. Loring sat at the table with the composed posture of a man who had nothing to confess and no idea why he was expected to confess anything at all. Inspector Whitcomb leaned forward. "You were seen speaking to the deceased shortly before her death." "Yes," Mr. Loring replied calmly. I was discussing a supply order for silk thread. And you expect us to believe that is all? I expect you to verify it, he said evenly. That answer, more than anything else, irritated Whitcomb. Outside the station, Willowbrook continued its judgment. He's too calm, Mrs. Peabody declared. That's what makes them dangerous, Mr. Griggs added wisely, though he had never met a dangerous man in his life. Only one voice remained uncertain, Miss Clara Wren. She stood near the churchyard gate that afternoon, twisting her hands together, visibly torn between loyalty and fear, and watching her from a short distance was Miss Marple. Miss Marple had learned long ago that innocence under strain often revealed more than guilt under pressure. She approached gently. "You look troubled, my dear." Clara started slightly. "Oh, Miss Marple, I... Yes, Miss Marple said softly. So do many people, though they think about her in rather different ways." Clara hesitated. Then, almost against her will, she said, "They're saying Mr. Loring killed her. But I don't understand why she would even speak to him about anything important. Did she trust him? I don't think she knew him well enough to trust him at all." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "That is often the case in business dealings," she said. "Trust is not always required, only necessity." Clara frowned slightly. "Necessity?" "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "Or dependence." Later that day, Inspector Whitcomb received new information that seemed to confirm his theory. A delivery record had been found. Mr. Loring had indeed supplied silk thread to Mrs. Frobisher's stall 2 weeks before the fete. The timeline fit, the presence fit, the opportunity fit. Everything in Whitcomb's mind now aligned neatly. "Case closed," he said with satisfaction. But Constable Harris, reading the same report, felt something uncomfortable. If he supplied the thread, Harris said carefully, then anyone who had access to it afterwards could. "Everyone had access," Whitcomb cut in. "That is not the point. The point is who introduced it." And yet Harris did not feel convinced, because cases, he was beginning to realize, rarely closed as neatly as senior inspectors believed. That evening Miss Marple visited the village hall. It was empty now, the remnants of the fete still faintly visible, torn bunting, a forgotten chair, the faint smell of lemonade lingering like a memory unwilling to leave. She stood near the embroidery stall, now dismantled, and looked at where Mrs. Frobisher had once sat. Everything seemed ordinary, too ordinary, and that, she knew, was often the first sign that something had been carefully arranged. A faint sound of footsteps interrupted her thoughts. Miss Clara Wren had followed her there. "I don't believe he did it," Clara said suddenly, as though the words had been forced out of her. "Mister?" I don't believe it." Miss Marple turned slightly. "Why not?" Clara hesitated. Then quietly, "Because Mrs. Frobisher was afraid of something else, not him." There was a pause. Miss Marple's eyes softened slightly. "Afraid of something else," she repeated. Clara nodded. "I saw her once late in the evening. She was working at the table, but she kept looking at the door, like she expected someone else." "Did she say who?" "No." Miss Marple looked toward the empty stall. "I see," she said gently. But inside her mind something shifted. A direction, not yet clear but no longer uncertain. That night Willowbrook slept uneasily. Inspector Whitcomb prepared his formal report. Mr. Loring remained under suspicion. The village began to relax into the comfort of an explanation. But explanations, Miss Marple knew, were not the same as truth. And somewhere in the quiet spaces between certainty and doubt, she sensed the real pattern beginning to reveal itself, not in the obvious places, but in the overlooked ones, like the inside of a sewing basket. Willowbrook had begun to relax again. It always did. Villagers were resilient in that way, not because they understood tragedy, but because they disliked it lingering too long. Grief, once properly acknowledged, was expected to retreat politely, like a guest who had overstayed her welcome. By the 5th morning after the death of Mrs. Lillian Frobisher, conversations in the bakery had already begun to drift back toward more comfortable subjects. The weather, the price of flour, and the unfortunate state of Mrs. Peabody's rose bushes. But beneath that surface normality something remained unsettled, not loud, not obvious, but present like a knot in fabric that had not yet been smoothed out. At the police station, Inspector Whitcomb was increasingly satisfied with his conclusion. Mr. Edward Loring remained the central figure. The silk thread, the business connection, the timing, all of it pointed in one direction, and Whitcomb was not a man who enjoyed looking in more than one. "The case is forming cleanly," he told Constable Harris. "That is always a good sign. Constable Harris, who had begun to suspect that clean cases were often the most dangerous illusion of all, only nodded. But elsewhere in Willowbrook the threads of the matter were not forming cleanly at all. They were crossing, tangling, overlapping in ways that suggested a pattern no one had yet fully seen. And Miss Marple was beginning to see it. Miss Marple sat in the small parlour of her cottage, though she was not knitting this time. Instead, she was listening to what people had said, but more importantly what they had not said. That was always where the truth hid. "Dependence," she murmured softly to herself. "Yes, that is the word that keeps returning." She folded her hands in her lap and closed her eyes briefly. Mrs. Frobisher had not been a woman of many friendships. She was respected, efficient, even admired, but not closely known. And yet someone had been close enough to influence her work, close enough to send her materials, close enough to shape the very method of her embroidery. That afternoon Miss Marple paid another visit, this time to the home of Miss Clara Wren. Clara answered the door quickly, as though she had been expecting someone, or perhaps fearing that someone might come. Her face brightened faintly when she saw Miss Marple.
"Oh, do come in."
The cottage was small, modest, and carefully maintained. Everything had its place, though there was a sense that order here was not natural. It was maintained, as if disorder might easily return if left unattended. Clara poured tea with slightly unsteady hands. "I keep thinking about it," she said suddenly. "About Mrs. Frobisher. About the thread." "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. "Threads do have a way of staying in one's mind." Clara gave a faint, uneasy laugh. "It sounds silly when you say it like that." "Oh, no," Miss Marple replied. "It is quite sensible. Small things often refuse to be small after something unpleasant has happened." There was a pause. Then Clara said quietly, "She used to get letters. Not often, but when she did, she always became— yes, more distracted, sometimes anxious. She would check the door more often. Once I even saw her hide a letter inside her sewing-basket." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened slightly. "Inside her sewing-basket?" Clara nodded. She thought I hadn't noticed, but I did. Miss Marple said nothing for a moment. Then, very softly, "And did you ever see who the letters were from?" Clara hesitated. "I don't know," she admitted. "There was no name, only initials once or twice, but she would tear them up afterwards." A faint silence settled between them. Outside a bird called sharply, then flew away. Miss Marple looked down into her teacup, and something inside her mind clicked, not fully into place, but close enough to change direction. That evening she walked slowly toward the churchyard again, not because she expected answers, but because she needed to see something with fresh eyes. The embroidery stall had been fully cleared now. Only faint marks remained in the grass where it had stood. But Miss Marple stood there for a long time, looking not at what was visible, but what had once been arranged there. Patterns, movements, habits. And then she spoke aloud, very softly. She was not afraid of a stranger. A pausa. She was afraid of someone she expected to see again. At that exact moment, in another part of the village, Inspector Whitcomb received a message that briefly unsettled his certainty. A second delivery record had been found, not for silk thread, but for a replacement spool casting a small, unremarkable item used to conceal or transport fine material without detection. The order had not been placed by Mr. Loring. It had been placed locally. Whitcomb frowned as he read it. "This is irrelevant," he said firmly. "It does not alter the primary suspect." But for the first time his tone carried a trace of irritation rather than confidence. Constable Harris, standing nearby, felt something shift inside him. A suspicion that the pattern was no longer pointing cleanly in one direction. That night Miss Marple sat by her window again. The garden outside was still, the air cool and quiet. But inside her thoughts there was movement, not confusion, arrangement. She was being controlled, she said softly. Not by force. A pausa. And that is always harder to see. She reached for her knitting at last, but did not begin. Instead she sat in stillness, because now she was no longer searching blindly. She was following a thread that had finally revealed its true direction, and it was not leading toward the obvious man in custody. It was leading somewhere much closer. By the sixth day, the case that had once seemed so neatly folded had begun to fray at the edges. Inspector Whitcomb did not like frayed edges. He preferred clean lines, clear motives, and suspects who behaved as suspects were supposed to behave. But Willowbrook, it seemed, was becoming increasingly uncooperative. And worst of all, it was beginning to produce contradictions. At the police station the atmosphere had shifted. The initial confidence surrounding Mr. Edward Loring had not entirely disappeared, but it was no longer solid. It had developed small, cracks, unspoken doubts that Constable Harris now noticed in the pauses between Whitcomb's statements. "The additional delivery record complicates nothing," Whitcomb insisted more sharply than before. "It merely suggests administrative overlap." But even he did not sound entirely convinced. Mr. Loring, still held for questioning, remained composed, but there was now a difference in the way he held himself. Not guilt, not fear, something closer to frustration. "I did not know Mrs. Frobisher beyond business," he repeated for what felt like the 10th time. "I supplied material. That is all." And this time even Whitcomb hesitated before replying. Outside, Willowbrook was beginning to whisper differently. Not he did it, but what if it isn't him? A dangerous shift, because once doubt enters a village, it does not remain confined to one idea. It spreads. Miss Marple noticed the change immediately. Miss Marple had never relied on public opinion for truth. In fact, she often considered it a distraction. But she did rely on patterns of belief, because when people began to change what they believed, it usually meant they were unconsciously reacting to something real. And something real had begun to surface. That afternoon she visited the small general store at the edge of the village. The owner, Mr. Pritchard, was a man who remembered everything except what was inconvenient. Miss Marple selected a few items she did not strictly need, and then, as if casually, asked, "You often receive deliveries for sewing materials, don't you?" Yes, Mr. Pritchard replied. "Thread, fabric, all sorts, from London suppliers?" Sometimes local distributors." Miss Marple nodded. "And do you recall delivering anything unusual to Mrs. Frobisher recently?" Mr. Pritchard hesitated. Then, almost reluctantly, he said, "There was one thing, a small box, very plain, no markings. I remember because she insisted on signing for it personally, even though I offered to leave it with Miss Wren." Miss Marple's attention sharpened slightly. "And did you see her open it?" "No," he said. "But I did notice something odd." "Yes?" "She looked relieved when she received it. Not anxious. Relieved. That word settled in Miss Marple's mind like a weight. Later that same day, another discovery changed the direction of the investigation entirely. Constable Harris, going through older correspondence files, found something that had been misfiled. A letter, not addressed to Mrs. Frobisher directly, but referenced in relation to her embroidery work through a third-party supplier. The sender's initials were unclear, but the content referred to continuation of arrangement and ensuring discretion. Inspector Whitcomb read it twice, then a third time. "This is meaningless without context," he said, but his voice had lost its earlier certainty. Because context, he realized, was exactly what they were missing. And then came the twist that no one in Willowbrook expected. Mr. Loring was released, not exonerated, simply no longer justifiable to hold. The village reacted immediately. Confusion replaced certainty. If it wasn't him, Mrs. Peabody whispered, then who? Even Mr. Griggs, usually so confident in his judgments, had nothing to add. And in that silence suspicion began to drift, not outward, but inward. Miss Marple stood near the church gate that evening, watching the village settle under fading light. Something had changed, not just in the case, but in the structure of assumptions. She spoke softly to herself. "Relief is a very revealing emotion. A pausa. And it does not belong to someone who fears a stranger." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "It belongs to someone who feared being discovered." That night she returned home earlier than usual. She did not knit. She did not read. Instead, she sat very still, thinking. The sewing basket, the silk thread, the letters, the relief. Each piece was no longer isolated. They were beginning to connect, and as she followed those connections carefully, patiently, like tracing invisible stitches in fabric, she reached a conclusion that made her expression grow very quiet indeed. "This," she said softly, "is not a crime of opportunity. A pausa. It is a crime of proximity." And for the first time the shape of the truth began to emerge, not clearly, not yet fully formed, but close enough to change everything. Willowbrook, like all villages, was fond of the idea that evil arrived from outside. A stranger in a coat, a visitor from London, a salesman with too many manners and too few explanations. It made things easier, more acceptable. But by the 7th day that comfort had begun to erode, because the stranger had been released, and nothing had happened to replace him, which meant slowly and reluctantly the village was being forced toward a far more uncomfortable possibility, that the danger had never been outside at all. Inspector Whitcomb was no longer in a good mood. He sat behind his desk, staring at the case notes as though they had personally betrayed him. "This is becoming unnecessarily complicated," he muttered. Constable Harris, standing nearby, kept his expression neutral. He had learned that neutrality was the safest response when certainty began to crack. Whitcomb tapped the table. No stranger motive, no financial dispute, no clear trigger. He leaned back. "Then we are missing the connection." And that was exactly what Miss Marple had begun to suspect. Miss Marple walked slowly through Willowbrook that afternoon, but she was no longer observing the village as separate households and individuals. She was observing it as a structure, a pattern of relationships, and somewhere within that pattern something had been deliberately hidden, not by distance, but by familiarity. She stopped outside the churchyard once again. The Reverend Harcourt was inside the church, and Miss Clara Wren was nearby, arranging flowers for no particular reason other than habit. Clara looked up as Miss Marple approached. "You've been thinking about it again, haven't you?" Clara asked quietly. "Yes," Miss Marple admitted. Clara hesitated. "Have you found something?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead she said, "Tell me, my dear, how long did you work with Mrs. Frobisher?" "Nearly 2 years," Clara replied. "After her previous assistant left. And before that?" Clara frowned slightly. "There wasn't much before that. She didn't keep staff long." "Interesting," Miss Marple said softly. Clara looked uneasy. "Why?" "Because," Miss Marple replied gently, "people who do not keep staff long often have difficulty maintaining distance." A pause. Clara's voice dropped slightly. "You think someone was too close to her?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "someone was not just close. I think someone was part of her routine." That word routine hung in the air a moment too long. Later that day, a detail long overlooked finally came into focus. Constable Harris, reviewing witness statements again, noticed something that had been dismissed earlier as irrelevant. Mrs. Frobisher had not been alone in her final hours before the collapse. Miss Clara Wren had been present, not as a visitor, not briefly, but continuously, helping, arranging, handling materials. The detail had been recorded, and then quietly ignored, because Clara Wren was not a stranger. She was trusted. When Inspector Whitcomb was informed, his reaction was immediate. "That is not significant," he said sharply. "She was an assistant. Of course she was present." But Harris hesitated. "Sir, she had access to everything. The sewing materials, the parcels, the thread." Whitcomb's expression tightened. "You are suggesting she poisoned her employer?" "I am suggesting," Harris said carefully, "that she could have." Silence followed, a heavier silence than before, because for the first time the suspect was no longer a convenient outsider. That evening Miss Marple visited her cottage garden. The air was still, but her thoughts were not. She spoke quietly to herself. "Dependency," she said. "That is what I was missing before." A pause. "And dependency always looks like trust until it doesn't." She folded her hands. Mrs. Frobisher had relied on someone who handled her materials, someone who managed her work, someone who knew exactly how the embroidery was made, and more importantly, how it could be altered. A memory surfaced in Miss Marple's mind. Clara Wren saying, "She always checked the door when she was working alone." But why would a woman fear solitude, unless solitude was not truly solitude? Later that night Willowbrook felt different, not because anything new had happened, but because something had been reinterpreted. The village had begun to shift its suspicion inward again, but this time not randomly, with direction, and Miss Marple knew that once suspicion found the correct direction, it rarely stopped there. It deepened. She sat by her window once more, looking out at the darkened village. "Closeness," she said softly. Then she added almost gently, "is the most dangerous place for secrets." A long pause followed, and then with quiet certainty, "I think I know who she was afraid of." By the 8th day, Willowbrook no longer felt like a village that had experienced a tragedy. It felt like a village that had begun to suspect itself. The comfort of an external culprit had faded entirely. Mr. Edward Loring's release had not restored peace, it had removed the only certainty people had been clinging to. And in its absence, attention turned inward with increasing unease. People began to re-examine conversations, recount small details, reinterpret ordinary moments as if they had always contained hidden meaning. And in such an atmosphere, even the innocent began to feel guilty of something, if only of not noticing enough. Inspector Whitcomb was now visibly irritated. "The case is becoming subjective," he complained. Constable Harris, standing by the window of the station, said quietly, "Oh, it is becoming accurate, sir." Whitcomb shot him a sharp look, but did not respond immediately, because even he could no longer ignore the direction things were taking. And Miss Marple had stopped guessing. She was now observing confirmation. Miss Marple moved through Willowbrook that afternoon with a calmness that, to anyone watching carefully, would have seemed slightly different from before. Not uncertainty, but resolution forming itself. She stopped outside Miss Clara Wren's cottage. This time she did not knock immediately. She simply stood there for a moment, looking at the neatness of the place, the controlled order, the careful presentation of a life that wanted to appear uncomplicated. Then she knocked. Clara opened the door almost at once. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said quickly. "Is something wrong?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Not wrong, my dear. Only—" Clara hesitated. "Clearer." "Yes," Miss Marple replied gently. "Sometimes when one looks at a pattern long enough, one begins to see where it has been altered." Clara's expression tightened slightly. "I don't understand." Miss Marple stepped inside. "I think you do," she said softly. A pause. Then she added, almost conversationally, "Tell me, Clara, who taught Mrs. Frobisher to handle that particular silk thread?" Clara blinked.
"I did."
"Yes," Miss Marple said. "That is what I thought." Silence fell. Not dramatic, not loud, but heavy enough to fill the small room completely. Clara turned away slightly. "She needed help," she said quickly. "Her hands weren't as steady as they used to be. I only assisted her." "Of course," Miss Marple agreed. "That is what assistants do." A pause. Then gently, "And when did you begin selecting her materials without her supervision?" Clara froze. The question was not loud, but it was precise. And precision, Miss Marple knew, was always unsettling to those who had built their lives around subtle control. For the first time Clara's composure slipped. "I never," she began. But Miss Marple raised a hand slightly. "No need to rush," she said kindly. "We are not in court. We are only understanding." She looked at Clara thoughtfully. "You see, my dear, there is something interesting about dependence. When someone depends on you for everything, even small things like thread or parcels, it becomes very easy to guide them without them noticing." Clara's breathing had changed slightly. Miss Marple continued almost softly, "And when guidance becomes routine, it stops feeling like influence at all." A pause. "It feels like care." Clara's voice came out sharper than before. "You are suggesting I harmed her." "I am suggesting," Miss Marple replied, "that you were the only person who had both access and reason to control what she used in her work." Clara turned fully toward her now. Her face was pale but not broken. "Not yet. She trusted me," Clara said. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "That is precisely why it worked." Silence again. But this time it was different. Something inside it had begun to crack. Outside, Willowbrook remained unchanged. A bird called somewhere in the distance. A curtain moved in another house. Life continued, unaware that something within it had just shifted toward exposure. Miss Marple did not press further. She simply stepped back slightly. "I think," she said gently, "we should allow Inspector Whitcomb to continue his formal inquiries." Clara did not answer, but her hands had begun to tremble. Not dramatically, just enough, and Miss Marple noticed everything. As she left the cottage, Miss Marple paused briefly at the gate. The pattern was no longer hidden. It was only incomplete, and now, for the first time, she felt the case approaching its final shape. Not accusation, not conclusion, but containment, a way of ensuring that truth would emerge without destruction spreading further than necessary. That evening she said softly to herself, "I believe I understand the thread now." A pause, and where it was pulled too tightly. Willowbrook did not notice the change at first. Villages rarely do, even when something fundamental shifts beneath their surface. Life continues in its familiar rhythm. Tea is brewed, bread is sliced, curtains are shaken out in the morning light. The human mind prefers continuity, even when continuity is no longer entirely true. But Miss Marple was not concerned with the village's comfort. She was concerned with the moment truth could be made to reveal itself without force. That morning Inspector Whitcomb received a polite request. It came through the Reverend Harcourt, who had been approached with an equally polite inquiry. Miss Marple wished, if possible, to examine the embroidery materials that had belonged to Miss Size. Frobisher one final time formally in the presence of the police. Whitcomb frowned at the request. "I see no value in revisiting already examined evidence," he said. But Constable Harris hesitated. "Sir, she has been correct before. That sentence hung in the room longer than it should have." Whitcomb disliked it for that reason alone. Finally he agreed. At the church hall the embroidery materials were laid out again on a long wooden table. Boxes, small tools, fabric samples, everything carefully catalogued, everything seemingly ordinary. And yet to those who knew how to look, nothing about it was truly ordinary any more. Miss Marple arrived quietly, as she always did. No announcement, no emphasis, just presence. Clara. Wren was already there. So was Inspector Whitcomb. The air in the room felt tighter than before. Not physically, psychologically. Miss Marple examined the materials without haste. She picked up a spool of silk thread, turned it gently in her fingers, then set it down again. "This is the same type," she said softly. Whitcomb nodded. "We already established that." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "But not where it came from." A pause. She looked up. "That, I think, is still not properly understood." Clara shifted slightly near the table. Whitcomb noticed. Miss Marple noticed more. She continued calmly. "When something is delivered regularly to a person," she said, "it becomes part of their routine. And when it becomes part of their routine, they stop questioning its origin." Her eyes rested briefly on Clara. "Isn't that so, my dear?" Clara said nothing, but her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the table. Inspector Whitcomb cleared his throat. "If you have a theory, Miss Marple, I would appreciate you stating it directly." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, Inspector. Direct statements are rarely as useful as understanding how people behave when they feel safe." She paused. "Or unsafe." Then she did something simple, almost insignificant. She placed a small object on the table, a letter fragment, recovered earlier, quietly obtained, not formally emphasized, just enough to exist. Clara looked at it, and for the first time her composure faltered visibly. Whitcomb noticed immediately. "What is that?" he demanded. Miss Marple answered gently. "Something that was never meant to be preserved." A pause. "And yet it was kept." Clara's voice came suddenly too fast. "That means nothing." But Miss Marple shook her head slightly. "Oh, it means something. It means someone could not bear to destroy every trace." Then Miss Marple added, "Especially when those traces belonged to someone who depended on them." That word again. Dependus. It settled heavily in the room. Whitcomb looked between them now, uncertain for the first time. Clara stepped back slightly. "No," she said quietly. "You don't understand." Miss Marple did not move. "I think," she said softly, "I understand rather too well." A pause. "And that is why I did not accuse you." Whitcomb blinked. "Why?" Miss Marple turned slightly toward him. "Inspector, an accusation would only produce denial, and denial is not useful at this stage." She looked back at Clara. "What is useful is recognition." The room was very still now. Clara's breathing had changed again. Shallower. Whitcomb took a step forward. "Miss Wren, if you have anything to say." But Miss Marple gently raised a hand. "Please, Inspector." "Not yet." Then, quietly, "We are very close." Clara's voice broke slightly. "I only helped her," she whispered. "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "At first—" A pause. "Until helping became controlling." The air in the room seemed to tighten further. Then Miss Marple said something different. Not accusation, not theory, observation. She was not afraid of Mr. Loring, she said. She was afraid of losing control of her arrangement. A pause. "And when someone depends on you completely, losing control can feel like losing oneself." Clara closed her eyes briefly. That small movement was enough. Whitcomb saw it now. Not guilt confirmed, but emotional fracture beginning. Miss Marple stepped back slightly. "Inspector," she said gently, "I think we have reached the point where further pressure will not help." Whitcomb frowned. "And what do you suggest?" Miss Marple looked at Clara. "I suggest," she said softly, "we allow the truth to emerge without forcing it to break." And for the first time Clara spoke without defense, only quietly. "She didn't want anyone else to handle it," she said. A pause. "She said I was the only one who understood her work." Her voice trembled slightly. "I only wanted it to stay that way." No one spoke immediately. Even Whitcomb did not interrupt, because something had finally surfaced, not full confession, not yet, but the emotional core beneath it. Miss Marple nodded gently. "Yes," she said, "that is always how it begins." A pause. "With care." Then she added softly, "and ends with control." The silence in the church hall did not feel empty any more. It felt occupied, as though every word spoken had settled into the air and refused to leave. Inspector Whitcomb no longer looked certain of anything. Constable Harris remained still, watching not the table but the people around it, and at the center of it all stood Miss Clara Wren, as though she had finally reached the edge of something she had been walking toward for a very long time without admitting it. And Miss Marple, as always, simply waited. Miss Marple did not raise her voice. She never needed to. "Clara," she said gently, "you said she trusted you because you understood her work." Clara's lips parted slightly, but no words came. Miss Marple continued, "And I believe that is true. Completely true." A pause. "That is what makes it so very sad." Clara's hands were trembling now, not dramatically, but continuously, like something inside her had begun to lose its structure. "I didn't mean," she started, but she stopped, because she did not know how to finish the sentence in a way that would make it disappear. Inspector Whitcomb stepped forward at last. "Miss Wren," he said more carefully now, "you must explain your role in this clearly." Clara let out a shaky breath. "I never wanted anything to happen to her," she said. And that sentence, small, fragile, incomplete, was the first real opening. Miss Marple nodded slightly. "Yes," she said, "that is always where it begins." A pause. "With something never meant to happen." Clara looked down at her hands. "She depended on me," she said quietly. "Everything came through me. The threads, the parcels, the orders, even the small changes she wanted in her work. I handled them." Her voice tightened. "She said I had better taste than she did." A faint, broken laugh escaped her. "She said she couldn't manage without me." The room seemed to tighten again, not with tension, but with recognition. Whitcomb's expression shifted slightly, not satisfaction, not yet, but understanding forming where confusion had been. Miss Marple spoke softly, "And when someone depends on you entirely," she said, "it becomes very difficult to separate care from control." Clara closed her eyes, as if hearing something she had known but never allowed herself to name. "There were letters," Clara said suddenly. Whitcomb looked up sharply. Clara continued, faster now. She started asking questions about suppliers, about where things were coming from. She didn't like that I handled everything. A pause. "I told her it was unnecessary worry." Her voice broke slightly, but she didn't stop. Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her tone remained steady. "And that frightened you?" Clara nodded once. "She said she wanted to check everything herself again." A pause. "And I couldn't let that happen." Silence followed immediately. Not heavy now, but absolute. Whitcomb spoke quietly. "So you interfered with her materials." Clara did not deny it. "Not any more." "I only changed small things," she whispered. "Only enough so she wouldn't notice at first." Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. "Enough to be gradual," she said softly. "That is always the most dangerous kind." Clara's voice grew thinner. She started feeling unwell, she said. She blamed fatigue, age, a pause. But she still didn't let go. Her eyes lifted now. I thought, if she slowed down, if she stopped questioning. Her voice broke completely. I didn't mean for it to go that far. No one spoke immediately. Even Whitcomb did not interrupt, because now there was no need for force, only completion. Miss Marple stepped forward slightly. "You used something that passed through her hands regularly," she said gently. "Something she trusted without question." Clara nodded faintly. "The thread," she whispered. A pause. "I never thought she would." She stopped again, because the sentence had nowhere safe to end. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. "You did not intend a visible act," she said. "You intended a controlled one, something that would not look like violence." A pause. "But control, once introduced, does not remain contained." Inspector Whitcomb finally spoke more quietly than before. "So it was not a stranger." Miss Marple looked at him. "No," she said softly. Then she added, "It was proximity, familiarity, and trust." Clara sank slightly into the chair behind her. Not dramatically, just enough that standing was no longer possible in the same way. "I only wanted her to stay the same," she said. A pause. "But she was changing." Her voice became almost childlike. "And I didn't know how to lose her without losing everything." Silence returned, but this time it was different. It was not the silence of mystery. It was the silence of understanding. Miss Marple turned slightly toward Whitcomb. "I think," she said gently, "that is all we need for now." Whitcomb nodded slowly. For once he did not argue. Clara did not resist when she was guided away later. There was no dramatic collapse, no final outburst, only exhaustion, as though the pattern she had held together for so long had finally come undone completely. Later, as the hall emptied, Miss Marple remained for a moment alone. She looked at the table, at the threads, at the small ordinary objects that had carried so much consequence, and she said quietly, "It is always the small stitches that decide the strength of the fabric. A pause, and when they give way, everything follows. Willowbrook did not change overnight. Villages rarely do. Even after the truth begins to surface, life continues in its familiar rhythm. Tea is still poured, gardens are still tended, and curtains are still drawn in the morning as though nothing irreversible has happened. But something has happened, and everyone knows it," the official inquiry concluded quietly. There were no dramatic courtroom scenes, no sensational newspaper headlines. Willowbrook was spared that kind of attention. The matter was recorded, filed, and resolved with a kind of administrative finality that often disguises emotional complexity. Miss Clara Wren gave her full statement. There was no denial left in her, only explanation. Inspector Whitcomb listened in silence as Miss Marple summarized what had taken him days to piece together. Miss Marple spoke not like a prosecutor, but like someone reconstructing a broken pattern. "It was not a sudden act," she said gently. "That is the first misunderstanding." A pause. "It was gradual influence, control disguised as assistance." She gestured slightly toward the case materials. "The silk thread was not inherently suspicious," she continued. "What mattered was who handled it, who altered its handling, and who ensured it passed through Mrs. Frobisher's hands without question." Whitcomb nodded slowly. "And the motive?" Miss Marple's expression softened slightly. "Dependence," she said simply, "and fear of losing it." Clara Wren had not acted from hatred. That perhaps was what unsettled everyone most. There had been no obvious rage, no visible cruelty, only attachment that had grown too tight. And then fear that a carefully maintained structure of control would be taken away. Miss Marple continued her explanation quietly. Mistress Frobisher did not realize she had become reliant on one person for everything related to her work, she said. That is often how it begins in small, trusted relationships. A pause. And when she finally began to question that arrangement, she stopped, because everyone now understood what followed. Inspector Whitcomb closed his notebook slowly. "So there was no outsider?" "No," Miss Marple said softly. "Only someone who was already inside the pattern." Clara's actions, when seen in full, no longer appeared sudden. They were incremental. Small adjustments in materials, subtle control over supplies, quiet decisions made under the appearance of care. Until the system itself had been altered without anyone noticing the moment it changed. That, Miss Marple knew, was always the most dangerous kind of crime, one that did not announce itself. Later that day Willowbrook returned to its quiet form. But it was not the same quiet as before. It was a quieter kind of awareness. People spoke more softly now, not because they feared one another, but because they had begun to understand how easily familiarity could hide intention. Miss Marple stood once more by her cottage window that evening. The garden was unchanged. The roses still bloomed. The path was still neatly swept. But her thoughts were no longer on the village. They were on human nature itself. "People think danger comes from outside," she said softly to herself. A pause. "But it is usually already known to them." She folded her hands. Already trusted. Inspector Whitcomb visited briefly before leaving Willowbrook. For once he did not argue with her conclusions. "You were right," he admitted reluctantly. Miss Marple gave a faint, almost kind smile. "I am only rarely right in advance," she said. "I simply notice what others do not wish to see." As he left, Constable Harris walked with him part of the way, and behind them Willowbrook began to settle again into its familiar shape. But something had changed in its memory. Not fear, not scandal, understanding. That night Miss Marple sat quietly in her chair for a long time. She did not knit. She did not read. She simply thought. About threads, about trust, about how easily both could be pulled too tightly. And then she said, almost gently, "It is never the sewing basket itself that is dangerous." A pause. "It is what someone chooses to hide within it." In Willowbrook, time did what it always did after a disturbance. It softened the edges. It blurred the sharpness of memory. And it slowly convinced people that what had happened was now safely contained in the past. But not everything can be neatly stored away like finished embroidery. Some patterns remain visible no matter how carefully one folds the fabric. A week had passed since the official conclusion of the case. Miss Clara Wren was no longer in Willowbrook. She had been taken quietly, without spectacle, to await formal proceedings elsewhere. The village spoke of it in lowered voices, as though even mentioning her name too loudly might disturb something unresolved. Mrs. Lillian Frobisher's house remained shut. The embroidery store was gone entirely. Even the green, once so lively with bunting and laughter, now looked slightly changed, not in appearance, but in feeling, as though it remembered something it wished it did not. Miss Marple did not avoid the subject when it came up in conversation. She never dramatized it either. When Mrs. Elridge at the post-office sighed and said, "Such a shame about Clara Wren, she seems such a nice girl," Miss Marple simply replied,
"Yeah."
That is often the difficulty, and that was all, because she understood something most people did not like to admit, that nice and dangerous were not opposites. They often lived very close together. One afternoon Miss Marple walked again along the church path. The Reverend Harcourt greeted her gently. "It feels quieter now," he said. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "Peaceful again," he added hopefully. Miss Marple paused slightly before replying. "I am never entirely sure," she said softly, "that quiet and peace are always the same thing." The Reverend looked thoughtful, but did not argue. He had learned, in his own way, that Miss Marple's observations were rarely casual. Later, Constable Harris visited her cottage. He seemed older than he had a week ago. "Do you think," he asked hesitantly, "that we missed something at the beginning?" Miss Marple considered this carefully. "Oh, no," she said gently. "I do not think you missed it. A pause. I think it was simply too small to notice until it had grown." Harris frowned slightly. "But how did you see it?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I did not see it," she said. "Not at first." She adjusted her knitting beside her, though she still did not begin it. "I noticed the shape of relationship," she continued. Who relied on whom? Who controlled small details? And who would be most disturbed if that control was questioned? A pause. And then I simply followed the thread. After he left, Miss Marple remained by the window. The garden was calm again. The roses were unchanged, but she looked at them differently now, not as decoration, but as something that grew from unseen connections beneath the soil. Everything, she thought, is connected if one watches long enough. That evening she reflected quietly. "There are crimes that begin with hatred," she said softly to herself. A pause. "And there are crimes that begin with care." She looked down at her hands, and those are the most difficult to recognize in time. The village of Willowbrook would speak of the case less and less as months passed. It would become a story, then a caution, then a faint memory told at tea-tables when conversation needed a gentle edge. But for Miss Marple it would remain something else entirely, a reminder, not of what people do, but of how easily they become what they believe they are protecting. And so life returned, not as it was before, but as it always does, quiet, and slightly more aware of what might be hidden beneath the most ordinary of seams. In Willowbrook, time did what it always did after a disturbance. It softened the edges. It blurred the sharpness of memory, and it slowly convinced people that what had happened was now safely contained in the past. But not everything can be neatly stored away like finished embroidery. Some patterns remain visible, no matter how carefully one folds the fabric. A week had passed since the official conclusion of the case. Miss Clara Wren was no longer in Willowbrook. She had been taken quietly, without spectacle, to await formal proceedings elsewhere. The village spoke of it in lowered voices, as though even mentioning her name too loudly might disturb something unresolved. Mrs. Lillian Frobisher's house remained shut. The embroidery stall was gone entirely. Even the green, once so lively with bunting and laughter, now looked slightly changed, not in appearance but in feeling, as though it remembered something it wished it did not. Miss Marple did not avoid the subject when it came up in conversation. She never dramatized it either. When Mrs. Elridge at the post-office sighed and said, "Such a shame about Clara Wren, she seems such a nice girl," Miss Marple simply replied, "Yes." That is often the difficulty, and that was all, because she understood something most people did not like to admit, that nice and dangerous were not opposites. They often lived very close together. One afternoon Miss Marple walked again along the church path. The Reverend Harcourt greeted her gently. "It feels quieter now," he said. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "Peaceful again," he added hopefully. Miss Marple paused slightly before replying. "I am never entirely sure," she said softly, "that quiet and peace are always the same thing." The Reverend looked thoughtful but did not argue. He had learned in his own way that Miss Marple's observations were rarely casual. Later, Constable Harris visited her cottage. He seemed older than he had a week ago. "Do you think," he asked hesitantly, "that we missed something at the beginning?" Miss Marple considered this carefully.
"Oh, no," she said gently.
"I do not think you missed it." A pause. "I think it was simply too small to notice until it had grown." Harris frowned slightly. "But how did you see it?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I did not see it," she said. "Not at first." She adjusted her knitting beside her, though she still did not begin it. "I noticed the shape of relationships," she continued. Who relied on whom? Who controlled small details? And who would be most disturbed if that control was questioned? A pause, and then I simply followed the thread. After he left, Miss Marple remained by the window. The garden was calm again. The roses were unchanged, but she looked at them differently now, not as decoration, but as something that grew from unseen connections beneath the soil. Everything, she thought, is connected if one watches long enough. That evening she reflected quietly. "There are crimes that begin with hatred," she said softly to herself. A pause, "and there are crimes that begin with care." She looked down at her hands. "And those are the most difficult to recognize in time." The village of Willowbrook would speak of the case less and less as months passed. It would become a story, then a caution, then a faint memory told at tea tables when conversation needed a gentle edge. But for Miss Marple it would remain something else entirely, a reminder, not of what people do, but of how easily they become what they believe they are protecting. And so life returned, not as it was before, but as it always does, quiet, and slightly more aware of what might be hidden beneath the most ordinary of seams. Autumn came quietly to Willowbrook, as though it did not wish to disturb anything that had already been disturbed enough. The leaves turned slowly, almost thoughtfully, and the lanes near the church filled with a soft rustling that sounded like pages being turned in a book. No one was reading aloud any more. Life had resumed its familiar shape, but it was not the same shape it had been before. There were small absences now in conversation, places where names were carefully avoided, and silences that arrived a fraction earlier than they used to. Miss Marple remained in her cottage, as she always did, but the village occasionally noticed her walking with a slightly longer pause near familiar places. The church green, the old embroidery store site, the post office where Mrs. Elridge still occasionally mentioned that poor Clara Wren, and then stopped herself, as though unsure whether the subject should be fully reopened or gently left alone. Miss Marple never corrected these pauses. She simply observed them. One morning a small package arrived at her door. No return address, plain wrapping, simple string, the sort of parcel that would not normally attract attention. But Miss Marple did not open it immediately. She looked at it for a long moment first. Then she said softly, "So there is still one thread remaining." Inside was not a confession, not evidence, not a dramatic revelation, only a piece of silk thread, the same pale shade used in Mrs. Frobisher's embroidery. Carefully wound, perfectly ordinary at first glance, but Miss Marple did not see it as ordinary. She never did. She held it gently between her fingers, and for a moment her expression was not analytical. It was thoughtful, almost sad, because she understood what it meant, not legally, not procedurally, but humanly. Sometimes she knew people do not fully release what they have done, not because they wish to continue it, but because they cannot entirely let go of the moment they crossed a line. Even when they have been understood, even when they have been forgiven in silence. She placed the thread back into its wrapping carefully, not as evidence, but as memory, and then she closed the box. That afternoon she walked once more along the village lane. The air was crisp now, the hedges had begun to thin, and Willowbrook looked from a distance exactly as it always had. That was its gift, and its danger. A young girl passed her on the path and smiled politely. Miss Marple returned the smile. Nothing in that exchange suggested murder. Nothing suggested fear. And yet, she thought, everything that matters begins in exchanges exactly like this, ordinary, unremarkable. Later she sat by her window as dusk settled in. The light faded slowly across her knitting basket, still untouched, still waiting. She spoke softly to herself. The most dangerous threads are never the ones that stand out. A pause. They are the ones that match perfectly. And in that quiet understanding there was no triumph, only awareness, that somewhere in Willowbrook or in any place like it there would always be another pattern forming beneath the surface. Invisible, waiting for someone to notice where it does not belong. Winter arrived in Willowbrook the way all seasons did, without announcement, but with certainty. The hedges lost their color. The mornings became sharper, the kind of cold that made conversation shorter and footsteps quicker. Even the church bells seemed to ring with less echo, as though the air itself had thickened. And yet life continued. It always does. Months had passed since the case had been closed, but in small villages, closed never meant forgotten. It meant only that the subject had been placed carefully into storage, taken out less often, discussed more quietly, and always with a sense that too much attention might reopen something better left settled. But Miss Marple knew better. Some things do not remain stored. They remain present. Miss Marple sat in her familiar armchair by the window, her knitting finely in her hands again. The rhythm of it was steady, comforting, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Not in the village as it was now, but in the pattern it had briefly revealed under pressure. She had seen what most people never saw. Not just a crime, but the way ordinary trust can slowly become structure, and structure can become control, and control, when strained, can become irreversible. There was a knock at the door, not urgent, not hesitant, simply respectful. Miss Marple already knew who it was before she opened it. Inspector Whitcomb stood there, hat in hand, slightly less rigid than before. "I was passing through," he said. Miss Marple smiled faintly. That is what people always say when they are not entirely sure they are passing through. He gave a brief, almost reluctant smile in return. They sat for a while in silence before speaking. Finally Whitcomb said, "I reviewed the case again." Miss Marple nodded gently. "That is often what happens after time has passed." He hesitated. "I understand it better now," he admitted. A pause. "Not the facts, the people." Miss Marple placed her knitting down carefully. "Yes," she said softly. "Facts are only the surface. People are the pattern underneath." Whitcomb looked down at his hands. "There was no grand motive," he said quietly. "No dramatic turning point." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "That is why it was difficult to see." A silence settled between them again, not uncomfortable, but reflective. Then Whitcomb said, "Do you ever find it disturbing?" Miss Marple looked at him with calm understanding. "Which part?" "That ordinary lives can hide something like that." She considered this for a moment, then replied gently, "I find it instructive." A pause. "People are not divided into ordinary and extraordinary, only into understood and misunderstood." Whitcomb stood to leave. At the door he paused. "Will there be another case like it?" he asked. Miss Marple looked out at the winter garden, the bare branches, the quiet earth, the stillness that always looked harmless until one remembered what could grow beneath it. "I imagine," she said softly, "there will always be another pattern somewhere." A pause. "But not always one that needs to be completed in the same way." After he left, Miss Marple remained at the window for a long time. The light outside faded further, and Willowbrook settled into its evening silence, not peaceful, not troubled, simply continuing. She spoke softly to herself at last. "Nothing is ever truly finished." A pause. "Only no longer visible." She picked up her knitting again, and resumed the steady rhythm, as though stitching together not wool, but understanding itself.